Good morning. Welcome back to ninth grade world history. We're going to dive right in, somewhat introduce something new, but also pick up where we left off. We will be looking at the second of our three critical standards. This one is identifying causes of the Great Depression. Now, before we talk specifically about this standard, I think it's important to go back and not only review a little bit, but also kind of connect the dots between these two standards. If you remember, our first critical standard was explain causes and consequences of World War I. Well, where we left off last time, we looked at some of those consequences. And in order to understand the causes of the Great Depression, we definitely need to revisit some of the consequences of World War I, because there were some of these consequences that led directly to the Great Depression. Now, while some of these consequences did lead to the Great Depression, they weren't solely responsible for the Great Depression. But let's start here and see if we can't connect to this. So, consequences of World War I. First consequence is obviously the tremendous loss of human life. There were approximately 9 million military deaths. Now that's not even counting civilian deaths, those injured in the war, and obviously as a result, people connected to those that were hurt or killed. So tremendous loss of life. And as you can see from this graphic, this represents the battlefield deaths. They're fairly evenly distributed among those that participated in World War I. Now, the U.S., who came in later in the war, had a lot less battlefield deaths, but nevertheless, each one of these individual deaths was significant. So one of the consequences is the loss of human life. Not only the loss and cost human life, but also the cost financially. Cost of the war itself. Wars are expensive, whether you're talking about buying uniforms and military supplies, to feeding the troops, moving them from one place to another, whatever. War is expensive. And then, as you can imagine, the destruction that the war caused, the cost to rebuild. We're either talking about roads and bridges or fixing the land, buildings in the cities, things like that. Tremendous cost. And as we're talking about money and the Great Depression, obviously this consequence of World War I would fit into one of those causes of the Great Depression. Another consequence of World War I was disillusionment. Disillusionment is this idea of a feeling of disappointment resulting from the discovery that something is not as good as one believed it to be. So, war, tremendous impact, but also just the mental impact of whether you were involved or knew someone that was. The world just isn't as great as we thought it was. The toll that it took, and this could play out a couple of ways: hopelessness and despair, but also, man, let's just put all that behind us and focus on now. And you'll see that, and you'll actually learn about it in your 11th grade world history class when you talk about the Roaring '20s in the United States. But disillusionment set in. You can see it a lot in the art and literature, music of the 1920s. And then finally, the consequence that we want to mention, and this is where we'll focus, because it really shaped what the world looked like after World War I, and that was the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is the palace that sits just outside of Paris, which is where this treaty got its name. But the Treaty of Versailles was that treaty that officially ended World War I, and some of the provisions of this treaty really led not only to the Great Depression, but to our third critical standard, which was the causes and consequences of World War II. And we'll see how this treaty played out in that as well. So 32 nations gathered together at the Paris Peace Conference to hammer out what would be known as the Treaty of Versailles. Now, even though there were 32 nations there was really just 3, and they were known as the Big Three. And these were the decision makers, the ones that hammered out specifically what it would look like. And these 3 nations were France, Great Britain, and the United States. What's interesting is not just who was there, but also who was not there to be a part of what post-war world would look like. Russia, a major player in World War I, was bogged down in the middle of a civil war, and they were not there. The losers of World War I, the Central Powers, Germany, and its allies, were not there either. The Treaty of Versailles this is pretty interesting. It was signed on June 28, 1919, which was 5 years to the day after that event took place. If you remember the causes of World War I, we said there were 3 isms, 2 alliances, and 1 event. And that 1 event was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And 5 years to the day, that treaty was signed. So as these nations gathered right outside of Paris at the Paris Peace Conference to hammer out this treaty, they all came with different goals. And we said there was those big 3 nations. So let's listen and think about what the goals would be for these particular countries. So first, let's start with the United States. So the United States got involved with the war late. Obviously, the fighting occurred in Europe and not in the United States. So we didn't feel that impact as much as these European countries. They came, and Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, came with this idea: we want to establish a just and lasting peace. We want a peace that's going to last, and we want justice and fairness for all these countries that were involved. And his plan was put together in what was known as the 14 points. I won't go through each one of those, but I do want to mention the 14th point. The 14th point is he proposed this establishment of what would be called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was an international peacekeeping organization where all the nations would come together and they'd try to iron out some of these squabbles and differences so that we could prevent another world war from happening. Now, as you know, looking back, that this League of Nations proved ineffective at preventing another world war. France had different goals. France, obviously, in the war from the jump, they shared a border with Germany. All of the fighting on the western front of the war took place in France. So not only tremendous loss of life, but also tremendous cost financially and having to rebuild. They came with different goals. We want to be secure. National security was top on their priority list. We want to make sure that we're protected and secure. Also, we want to punish Germany. Look, these jokers started this. We need to make sure that they're punished. And so they proposed that we need to strip Germany of any of its war-making powers, things like limiting its military and navy, no air force, stuff like that, so that we can make sure that Germany won't be able to attack us again. And then we're going to punish them. Now, the third country, Great Britain, was probably somewhere in between the two. Not on mainland Europe. Fighting didn't occur in Britain, so they didn't experience that cost in that sense. They too wanted national security, particularly with the waters surrounding Great Britain, and wanted to limit Germany and its navy specifically, to strip Germany of its war-making powers, but they weren't wanting to be quite as harsh with Germany as France was. They would love for Germany actually to be rebuilt so they could trade with them, and that would be good for everybody. So they came with different goals. So let's see specifically what the provisions, what did they come up with? First, they did take Woodrow Wilson's idea, the United States' idea of establishing a League of Nations. So they did that. Secondly, Germany lost some territory on both borders, the border side with France as well as the border side with Russia. They did put a restriction on Germany's military, particularly the number of soldiers that they could have, no air force, limited the number of ships that they could have, things like that. Severe restrictions on Germany's military to make sure that they could not rebuild and attack again. And if you remember back when we were talking about imperialism and these European countries taking over places, particularly in Africa and Asia, well, Germany was involved in that, where they lost all of those overseas territories. And then probably the one that really not only led to the Great Depression or to the global worldwide depression, but also partly to World War II, and they made Germany sign what was called a war guilt clause, that they were solely responsible for World War I, and they had to pay reparations. That's money that they had to pay out, basically saying it's our fault and we need to make restitution for the damage that we caused. So this was the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. There were several other treaties hammered out. Other nations that were not part of the Central Powers lost territory, that were part of the Central Powers lost territory in other treaties, particularly like the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary was completely broke apart, stuff like that. So some of the effects of this Treaty of Versailles. It became known as the treaty built on quicksand. This wouldn't last. The way that it was set up, it just wasn't just. I mean, if you think about who was not involved, Germany and Russia specifically not involved in hammering out the provisions of this treaty, we knew this wasn't going to last. And in fact, one of the big three that came up with some of these provisions rejected the treaty itself. If you think about the way our government is structured, the president can go negotiate these treaties, but the Senate actually has to okay those treaties, and they rejected it. The sentiment of the American people, we want to stay out of all that stuff over there. We want to stay out of European affairs, foreign affairs. One of the effects that left a legacy of bitterness and hatred from Germany, especially the fact that they had to claim sole responsibility and pay out all these reparations. And then these African and Asian territories from the imperialism, many of them thought that they were about to gain their independence. Didn't happen. They were then shifted into what they called mandates, which was just a fancy name for imperialist control of these colonies. So they weren't granted independence. And then some allied nations got less than they thought that they should, particularly Italy and Japan, who fought. They got less out of this whole treaty than they felt like they deserved. And then, as we'll see later, the League of Nations proved incapable of helping with international disputes. And we'll see that on the forefront of World War II. So let's look specifically, even though we looked at some of the consequences of World War I, let's look specifically at the causes of Great Depression, which is critical standard number 2. So what did the post-war world look like? Well, the post-world war or post-world economies. Only 2 nations came out better after World War I than when they entered. That was the United States and Japan. What about power? Power began to shift. Not only did the money begin to shift, but political power began to shift too. Europe, devastated by World War I, began to lose not only financial power, but also political power. The United States came out as the world's major superpower. So if you think about it, as the United States financially and politically began to gain power, and Europe and the nations within Europe began to lose economically as well as political power, it set the stage for this collapse. What about post-war Europe itself? So as the war ended, these new nations were formed, new governments were put in place, and some of these new democracies are ruled by the people. New democracies that were set up were very unstable, shaky. Hard for them to agree on how things should go. Different ideas on how to rebuild and how to rule and how much say-so people get, things like that. And democracy being new to many of these countries, how does this even work? How does this play out? Who gets a say-so? How should we set it up? And these democracies were very unstable. Let's give a specific example of Germany. Germany, after the war, set up what was called the Weimar Republic. A republic is a rule by elected officials. And huge inflation set in. They were tasked with rebuilding Germany. Well, what's inflation? Inflation is where your printed paper money loses its value and the price of goods goes up. Let me give you an example. Like a loaf of bread, probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a loaf of bread might be $1. Well, now that same loaf of bread might be $1.50. Well, did the bread all of a sudden just get better? No, not necessarily. Just the cost of that bread rises and the value of my dollar begins to decrease. Well, Germany experienced huge inflation. One of the most famous photographs of this time as the Depression began to set in was this is in Germany with these two young children playing with huge stacks of the German mark, which is their version of $1. Let me give you this quote to kind of put this in perspective. Severe inflation set in. Germans needed more and more money to buy even the most basic goods. For example, in Berlin, a loaf of bread cost less than a mark in 1918, right at the end of World War I. More than 160 marks in 1922, just 4 years later. And then some 200 billion marks by late 1923. That's for a loaf of bread. People took wheelbarrows full of money to buy food. Definitely something's got to change. There was an American banker named Charles Dawes that came up with a plan, and it did work a little bit, helped stabilize Germany's economy. Germany tried to engage with other nations, make peace with the world, signed a treaty with France. Things looked like it was moving forward. They even joined the League of Nations. So what happened to cause all this to fall? Well, if you remember, we talked about the U.S. growing in power financially and politically. If something happens in the United States, the whole thing's going to collapse. And in the 1920s, following World War I, U.S. experienced a booming economy. Things were going great. 11th grade world history, they'll talk about it, called the Roaring '20s. And there was a severe overproduction of goods. People saw this as an opportunity to make a bunch of stuff, sell it, get rich. And when factories and farms begin to overproduce goods, well, what ends up happening is there's more out there than people are willing to buy, and the price of that stuff goes down. There was also an uneven distribution of wealth. The wealthiest 5% got wealthier, but the majority of the people still couldn't buy these goods that were being produced. So what happened? Well, people buy less. Well, if people buy less, factories produce less. And if factories produce less, well, then factories lay off workers because they're producing less and not making as much money. And if factories lay off workers, guess what? Those people can't buy things, so people buy less, and here we got this cycle. And eventually this cycle led to the stock market crash in October of 1929. People began to gamble on this economy that seemed to be going so good, and now all of a sudden it began to crash. And this didn't necessarily cause the depression, but definitely sped it up and signified that this was actually happening. And so individual people lost tons and tons of money that had gambled on this stock market, but also businesses began to collapse, and this whole cycle repeated itself over and over. And if the U.S. goes down, the whole thing's going to collapse. That's exactly what happened. It became not just a U.S. depression, but a global depression. What was the U.S. response? Well, we got to stop buying other people's stuff and buy U.S. stuff. So they placed high tariffs, which is a tax on imported goods, to keep people from buying their stuff and buying our stuff. What was the world's response? Well, if they're going to put a high tariff to keep them from buying our stuff, we're going to put a high tariff on our stuff so that we won't buy American stuff. And what ended up happening was world trade dropped by 65%. Germany and Austria were especially hard hit. I want to look at real quick at several countries and their response and effectiveness to this global depression. Britain, they tried to get along. They formed a political coalition, instituted tariffs and taxes that actually slowed this depression. Recovery was steady but slow, but the democracy that was there was preserved. France didn't go quite as good. There was more political instability, but there was enough reforms, even though that there was high unemployment, democracy was preserved. Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, and Finland instituted large public works projects and welfare for the elderly and poor, high taxes. It actually resulted in economic health, democracy preserved. What about the United States? New president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, instituted large public works projects as part of what he would call the New Deal. Welfare reforms were instituted to try to provide for those that, poor, elderly, things like Social Security instituted during that time, as well as economic reforms with the banking system, stock market, to try to build American trust back in the economy. And there was a slow recovery and democracy was preserved. But you know and I know, if things aren't going good, you're going to look to the leaders, right, to make decisions to help things get back on the right track, right direction. And even though it worked in some of these places and democracy was preserved, in other places it didn't work out so well. And there were some scary responses to this. I wanted to get this quote straight out of the textbook because I think it does a good job of setting the scene. If we talk about the causes of the Depression and what it leads into with World War II, listen to this. Many democracies, including the United States, Britain, and France, remain strong despite the economic crisis caused by the Great Depression, and we just saw that on the chart. However, millions of people lost faith in democratic government. They're not getting the job done. We need something new and different. In response, they turned to an extreme system of government called fascism. Fascists promised to revive the economy. I'm going to fix this. Punish those responsible for hard times and restore order and national pride. Their message attracted many people who felt frustrated and angered by the peace treaties that followed World War I and by the Great Depression. We're frustrated and we need a change. So how did people you'll see like Hitler and Mussolini, how did they come to power? Because people were looking for answers. And so, even though this will be our next critical standard that we'll look at next week, I wanted to go ahead and put this in your mind, describe causes and consequences of World War II. You could see how things like the Great Depression and the treaties that were hammered out following World War I would leave an unstable era that would give way to World War II. I want to revisit these as a matter of review. Some of these consequences of World War I led to the Great Depression. And then when the economy collapsed in America, it set off this wave of global depression where economies just were essentially destroyed in this slow rebuild that happened in some countries, good in some, and then as we'll see, it gave way to some pretty evil people prior to World War II. I hope this was very helpful to you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week when we talk about the causes and consequences of World War II.